It was a night that promised glamour, glitter, and a convergence of the most powerful names in Hollywood. The kind of event that photographers dream of and social media influencers can only fantasize about. And yet, for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, it turned into something entirely unexpected, a silent snub, a moment of social invisibility in a room designed to celebrate one of the most iconic figures in entertainment, Kris Jenner on her 70th birthday. Imagine arriving at a party of the century, dressed to the nines, cameras flashing around you, only to be met with barely a glance. How would you react? Would you hold your head high, retreat quietly, or confront the audacity of being ignored by the queen of reality television herself? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outside, it may have seemed like another celebrity gathering: champagne, designer gowns, Hollywood smiles frozen in perfectly curated snapshots. But the tension in the air was palpable. It was as though the room, filled with power and influence, collectively decided to draw a line. Here, the Sussexes were not welcome. And the question on everyone's mind, those who noticed and those who didn't, was simple. Was this deliberate, or just a strange coincidence in the chaotic universe of celebrity events? The story begins hours before the party, long before the lights, the cameras, and the velvet ropes. Invitations were sent with meticulous care. Every detail was considered: seating arrangements, gift expectations, guest timing, and the subtle choreography that Kris Jenner, as a master strategist, always executes flawlessly. There was a guest list that read like a who's who of Hollywood royalty: actors, directors, producers, socialites, and influencers whose names alone can command headlines. And then, tucked near the middle of the list, were the Sussexes. Some whispered it was a peace offering, others speculated it was merely a public relations stunt. Either way, their arrival promised fireworks, and not necessarily the kind found in celebratory displays. Harry and Meghan stepped out of their sleek, black luxury car, the crowd of waiting paparazzi erupting into a frenzy. Flashes lit the night, reflecting in the sparkling jewels and tailored suits. Meghan's smile was perfect, but her eyes told a different story, a mix of excitement, nerves, and the faintest hint of premonition. Harry, ever the composed figure, adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the crowd, his jaw tight. The first moments inside should have been a series of greetings, handshakes, embraces, small talk over champagne. But something was off. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the dynamics at play. They moved into the grand hall. The chandeliers cast warm golden light over the elegantly dressed guests, each one seemingly absorbed in their own social orbit. And yet, the Sussexes found themselves adrift. Eyes that should have met theirs politely, warmly, even curiously, slid past. Greetings were delayed or avoided. Conversations paused at their approach. It wasn't hostility, at least not overtly. It was something far more subtle, far more devastating. The art of social invisibility, executed flawlessly by those who knew precisely how to do it. It was an invisible barrier, one that said without words, "You are here, but you are not part of this moment." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Some guests whispered to each other, sensing the tension before it was even acknowledged. The cameras, those unblinking witnesses to every celebrity triumph and faux pas, began to pick up the story. But nothing could quite capture the nuance of a social snub played out over champagne flutes and designer heels. The whispers were faint, yet they carried weight. There were questions circulating backstage. Was this a calculated maneuver by Kris Jenner? Was it orchestrated? Or was it simply the byproduct of Hollywood politics, egos, and the unspoken hierarchies of fame? Inside, the Sussexes tried to navigate this new terrain. Meghan, ever conscious of image, offered smiles, soft greetings, and gentle attempts at conversation. Harry, protective and watchful, stayed close, assessing the room and the subtle shifts in energy. Every attempt at engagement seemed to meet a wall of polite indifference. The irony was sharp. A room full of people who had built careers on attention and influence, ignoring two individuals whose very presence commands headlines worldwide. The dissonance was jarring, even comical, yet underlaid with a deep sense of humiliation. Meanwhile, Outside the public eye, things were happening that would only later emerge through leaks, whispers, and social media fragments. A private text message circulated among the inner circle. A subtle glance between two high-profile guests was captured by an unseen photographer. Every detail mattered. Every gesture, every silence, and every calculated avoidance contributed to a narrative that was forming far from the cameras, one that would dominate headlines in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. The story of a snub that was not just social, but strategic, carefully choreographed, and meticulously documented. The significance of this night goes beyond mere celebrity gossip. It underscores the collision of royal protocol with Hollywood spectacle, the clash between centuries-old etiquette and modern media-savvy influence. For Harry and Meghan, it was more than embarrassment. It was a statement, a message in the silent language of gestures, glances, and unspoken social codes. What were the implications for their public image? How would fans, detractors, and curious onlookers interpret the nuances of this event? And most importantly, what did it reveal about the unseen power structures within the glittering world of celebrity, structures that few outsiders ever get to see? As the evening progressed, the tension thickened. Conversations turned quieter when the Sussexes approached, and the air of polite avoidance became almost tangible. There was humor in some moments, the awkward pauses, the missed handshakes, the attempts to steer conversations elsewhere. Yet it was humor laced with humiliation. Meghan's famous charm and Harry's calm composure were tested in a setting where social cues were weaponized with precision. Every observer who knew the players could read the unspoken rules, and the Sussexes found themselves suddenly playing a game for which they had no manual. And then came the first real sign that this night would not follow the expected script. Something happened on the grand staircase, moments before the first toast. A fleeting glance, a whispered word, a subtle repositioning of bodies, almost imperceptible, yet charged with meaning. Those who captured it on camera would later note how frozen the Sussexes appeared, a brief pause in their otherwise fluid movement through the crowd. The audience would not see the whispered negotiations, the private remarks, the subtle orchestration of social dominance. But the effect was clear. The room, for a brief moment, collectively acknowledged their presence, not with welcome, but with a calculated, almost surgical avoidance. The stakes were high. This was not merely a party. It was a demonstration of influence, of power, and of social currency. Each snub, each ignored greeting, each slight diversion was a message. The Sussexes had entered a world where visibility equals power, and yet, paradoxically, invisibility had been wielded against them with devastating effect. It was a lesson in Hollywood's silent hierarchies. The most subtle gestures often speak louder than the most extravagant speeches. And while the world watched the flashes and smiles, the real story unfolded quietly, beneath the surface, in the unspoken language of the elite. By the end of the evening, Harry and Meghan's attempts to integrate had produced little reward. The snubs were subtle yet pervasive, and their impact, both immediate and long-term, was profound. It wasn't just a single slight. It was a series of calculated actions designed to communicate a truth about their place in the social order, and perhaps, to the world, a reminder of the fragile intersection of royalty and celebrity. The Sussexes were not shunned publicly in a dramatic, headline-grabbing moment, but rather erased in the most effective way possible: invisibility. And just when it seemed that the night could not become more tense, the cameras captured something that would be replayed, analyzed, and dissected endlessly on social media. A brief exchange, a glance, a whisper, an unspoken acknowledgement that spoke volumes without a single word. This moment, subtle yet electrifying, would set the stage for the revelations and drama that lay ahead, the conversations backstage, and the fallout that would dominate headlines worldwide. It was a moment that proved the old adage: in Hollywood, perception is everything, and sometimes silence can be louder than words. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was supposed to be a night of glitz, glamour, and celebrity spectacle, the kind of event that makes tabloid editors salivate and social media explode. Kris Jenner's 70th birthday had been hyped for months, billed as the ultimate gathering of Hollywood royalty, reality TV royalty, and yes, even actual royalty. Invitations had been whispered about in exclusive circles long before they were mailed. The guest list alone could make someone's head spin. A-list actors, influential directors, top-tier producers, fashion icons, and social media influencers whose names alone command millions of followers. Everyone wanted to be there. And then there were the Dukes, Harry and Meghan, whose very presence guaranteed headlines, for better or worse. The moment of arrival was cinematic. The night sky of Los Angeles glittered with city lights. Paparazzi lined the streets like eager soldiers waiting to capture the first glimpse of history. Harry and Meghan stepped out of their sleek black car, and the flash of cameras was instantaneous. Photographers jockeyed for the best angles, shouting names, gesturing, clicking shutters incessantly. It should have been a triumphant entrance, a moment of high visibility for two of the world's most famous figures. But the initial moments revealed a different reality. Something in the atmosphere shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The crowd inside had already begun to notice. Celebrities milling about in designer gowns and tuxedos paused mid-conversation, eyes flicking toward the new arrivals. Yet, instead of the expected warm greetings or even polite acknowledgments, there was hesitation. A subtle recoil, a quiet step back, averted eyes. Harry adjusted his suit jacket, a slight tension in his jawline, scanning the room. Meghan's smile was precise, polished, professional, but her eyes betrayed the first spark of unease. Something was off. They moved through the entrance, navigating the throngs of VIPs. For Harry and Meghan, the path was clear, well-rehearsed in their minds. Handshakes, brief hellos, small talk, photo ops, the dance of social engagement they had mastered through countless royal events and Hollywood appearances. But each attempted interaction was met with a strange void. Guests nodded politely, but moved on. Conversations paused briefly and then resumed without them. A laughter would ripple across the room, but the Sussexes were conspicuously absent from the circle. Imagine it. Walking into a room where every eye is technically on you. Every camera is pointed at you, yet no one acknowledges you. It is a paradox of visibility and invisibility. For Meghan, who had built a public persona on charm, media savvy, and approachability, it was jarring. She offered soft greetings, extended hands, smiles, even jokes, all met with polite avoidance. Harry, protective and cautious, stayed close, eyes scanning, calculating, assessing. There was a strategy behind every glance, every movement, and now he was recalibrating in real time, reading a room that was actively rewriting the rules on the fly. The irony was biting. In a room obsessed with fame, status, and perception, the most powerful act of influence was invisibility. It was not aggression, not rudeness, but something more subtle and effective, a collective, almost choreographed ignoring. Harry and Meghan were present, yet the room operated as if they were not. For any observer who knew what to look for, the dynamics were clear. This was deliberate. Every pause in conversation, every diversion of eye contact, every politely ignored greeting was part of an unspoken narrative unfolding silently, invisibly. Behind the smiles and champagne flutes, tensions simmered. Whispers traveled through the inner circles, subtle but charged with meaning. Did Kris Jenner orchestrate this? Was this the careful execution of a social stratagem meant to assert dominance? Or was it a product of Hollywood's complex web of alliances, egos, and rivalries? Those who knew the guests well could read the silent language, the gentle avoidance, the subtle shift of bodies away from the Sussexes, the almost imperceptible tightening of conversations when they approached. The Sussexes were not strangers to scrutiny, nor to awkwardness, but this was different. At royal events, they often expected protocol, predictable formalities. In Hollywood, they had learned the delicate art of charm, the currency of visibility, the importance of strategic interaction. But what they encountered that night defied both experiences. It was not hostility in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no overt confrontations, no public shaming. It was something more effective, more psychologically piercing. A room collectively decided, subtly but unmistakably, that they would not exist within it. Meghan tried to adapt, gracefully, strategically, but each effort seemed to dissolve into thin air. Handshakes offered met resistance in the form of delayed responses or redirected attention. Conversations started and ended with polite nods and smiles, leaving gaps of silence that were uncomfortable, almost loud. The cameras were relentless, capturing every nuance, every flicker of emotion. Harry's attempts to anchor the situation, subtle gestures of reassurance, careful scanning of the room, quiet cues to Meghan, provided some stability, but the pattern was clear. Observers who noticed commented in hushed tones. The Sussexes were being subtly isolated. For insiders, the implications were staggering. In Hollywood, visibility is power. To be rendered invisible, even temporarily, is a demonstration of control, influence, and hierarchy. The people in that room wielded it like an unspoken weapon, and the Sussexes were the subject of its silent precision. This was more than a party slight. It was a statement about social order, status, and the invisible rules governing celebrity interactions. And yet, there were moments that amplified the tension even further. A slight glance from a high-profile guest, the careful avoidance of a photo op, the whispered exchange between two insiders who had clearly noticed the snub, all contributed to the unfolding drama. Harry and Meghan moved through the space with the grace of practiced professionals, but even grace could not mask the dissonance between expectation and reality. They were prominent, visible, yet treated as background elements in a meticulously choreographed social play. As the evening progressed, the pattern persisted. Meghan, usually confident and engaging, started to show signs of frustration masked behind measured smiles. Harry, vigilant and protective, tightened his posture, eyes scanning for both opportunity and threat. Every step, every word, every attempt at interaction carried the weight of potential misstep or minor humiliation. And all the while, the cameras captured moments that would later be dissected on social media. The subtle tensions, the almost imperceptible distancing, the unspoken communication that revealed far more than any public statement could. The moment was made even more charged by the knowledge that the world was watching. Every action would be replayed, analyzed, and interpreted. For the Sussexes, this was a familiar sensation, but never in quite this way. This was Hollywood, where social currency is instantaneous and unforgiving. A glance, a gesture, a hesitation could become a headline. And in this instance, every move seemed to amplify the unspoken message. You are here, but you are not part of this moment. And then, just as they thought they might find a foothold, a subtle incident occurred on the grand staircase, a place where many of the evening's key interactions were expected to take place. A fleeting glance exchanged between two influential guests, a whispered word barely audible, a shift in body positioning that diverted attention away from the Sussexes. All of it captured on camera by someone who noticed the silent choreography. For a brief moment, the entire evening seemed to pivot on an invisible axis, one that Harry and Meghan had not anticipated. The cameras did not miss it, and neither would social media. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of the night. The Sussexes froze for a fraction of a second, the subtle impact of the room's collective indifference hitting with full force. For an observer, it was a masterclass in social invisibility. For Harry and Meghan, it was a jolt, a quiet realization that this event was more than just a party. It was a demonstration of power, of hierarchy, and of subtle social dominance. The true story of the night would not be the glamorous arrivals, the glittering gowns, or the champagne. It would be the invisible threads of influence, carefully manipulated, silently wielded, and devastatingly effective. And as they moved deeper into the room, trying to navigate conversations and photo opportunities, they could feel it. The narrative of the night was being written without them. Every glance, every diverted conversation, every polite avoidance added to the story that the world would later try to decode. The Sussexes were the focal point, yet paradoxically, the most ignored figures in the room. Their very visibility, in theory their greatest asset, had been turned into a spotlight illuminating their exclusion. But what came next would push the situation beyond awkwardness into something far more revealing, a moment that nobody in the room, nor the millions watching online, could have predicted. And it would change the trajectory of the evening, leaving the Sussexes confronting not just the discomfort of being snubbed, but the deeper implications of what such a public, yet silent, exclusion really meant. When Harry and Meghan arrived, all eyes should have been on them. But the real orchestrator of the evening had a different plan. Kris Jenner, The matriarch of the Kardashian-Jenner empire is not just a party host. She is a strategist, a social engineer, a master of optics. Every guest, every detail, every photograph is a carefully curated element in the narrative she wants to tell. And that night, her statement was silent, precise, and devastatingly effective. The room was lavish, of course, as expected from a birthday bash of this magnitude. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like frozen waterfalls, reflecting golden light across polished floors and velvet-lined staircases. The scent of gourmet cuisine and delicate florals mingled in the air, creating a rich tapestry of luxury and sensory indulgence. The music, curated, rhythmic, and subtle, set the tone, elegant, celebratory, and commanding. Every element was part of the stage, and every stage has its director. That director, that invisible hand, was Kris Jenner. From the very moment the Sussexes entered, she had already sent her first signal. A nod here, a hand gesture there, a slight step back. Each micro-movement a carefully designed communication. She was the silent queen of the room, and the room responded accordingly. The other guests, trained or accustomed to her cues, immediately picked up on the subtle shifts. Harry and Meghan, experienced in public protocol and high-profile appearances, were ill-prepared for a strategy that did not involve direct confrontation but invisible manipulation. Kris's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room continuously. It was almost imperceptible to the untrained observer, but anyone who has studied her public behavior would recognize the pattern. A brief glance in one direction, a flick of her wrist, a soft tilt of the head. These were signals, not gestures. Signals to her inner circle, to the photographers, to the room itself. In her world, silence can carry more weight than words, and her silence that evening spoke volumes. The subtlety was almost theatrical. Guests who approached Kris expecting her attention received small gestures, polite acknowledgement, a flicker of recognition, but never full engagement. For Harry and Meghan, who were trying to navigate this new environment, it became apparent quickly. Kris Jenner's attention, or lack thereof, was a statement. And it was a statement the room was conditioned to understand. In Hollywood, gestures like this are more effective than public confrontation. They shape narratives, create tension, and elevate those who command attention while quietly diminishing those who do not. It was not aggression, exactly, but power, the kind of influence that is invisible yet undeniable. Harry's posture stiffened slightly as he observed Kris from across the room. Meghan's smile, carefully maintained, began to falter under the subtle pressure. They were accustomed to public scrutiny and strategic interactions, but what Kris was doing required a different kind of reading, the silent language of elite social hierarchy, where invisibility can be weaponized. The seating arrangements were no accident either. Every chair, every table placement had been considered carefully. The closest tables to Kris were reserved for those whose social power, alignment, or influence had been pre-approved. The Sussexes, despite their fame and celebrity, were placed in a location that maximized their visibility to the cameras but minimized their direct connection to the matriarch herself. It was a brilliant, surgical move. Visibility without access. Recognition without interaction. It was subtle, cruel, and effective. Some guests tried to bridge the gap, stepping into the path of the Sussexes to initiate conversation or offer polite greetings. But even those interactions were under the silent control of Kris. A gentle flick of her eyes, a subtle step toward one guest, and the flow of interaction changed. Conversations paused. Jokes went untimed. Laughter shifted to other corners of the room. The Sussexes became aware of the invisible boundaries, lines drawn not in ink, but in social choreography. It was almost cinematic in its execution. Meghan attempted to approach Kris at one point, offering her customary charm, her radiant smile, the effortless warmth that has charmed millions on camera. Kris acknowledged her, briefly. A nod, a soft smile, the kind that conveys courtesy without engagement. Then, she pivoted, drawing the room's attention elsewhere. Guests followed her lead instinctively, leaving Harry and Meghan momentarily adrift. It was not humiliating in the dramatic, overt sense. It was humiliating in the slow, invisible way that erodes confidence and undermines public perception without a single word being spoken. Observers who would later recount the scene in detail described the precision with which Kris controlled the room. It was as if she were conducting an orchestra of influence, each guest a carefully placed instrument, every gesture orchestrated to create harmony or dissonance, depending on the target. And in this composition, the Sussexes were outsiders, not through any public confrontation, but through the subtle, almost imperceptible language of social dominance. The silence surrounding them was deafening, not the kind of silence filled with tension that one might see in a dramatic confrontation, but a more insidious silence, the quiet acknowledgement of presence without recognition. Harry moved through the crowd, attempting small interactions, his eyes scanning for openings. Meghan, ever aware of optics and image, tried to maintain composure, offering smiles and conversational cues. But each effort seemed to dissipate into the air, absorbed by the controlled choreography of the room. Even the photographers, trained to capture every moment of celebrity entrance, were guided, consciously or unconsciously, by Kris's presence and control. Certain angles were emphasized, others avoided. Some flashes highlighted interactions between other guests while carefully avoiding prolonged attention on the Sussexes. Every moment captured reinforced the narrative. They were here, yes, but they were not part of the core circle. What made it even more potent was the timing. Kris, fully aware of the media's omnipresence, paced her engagement strategically. She would pause for one guest, make a discreet adjustment of her posture, then move to another, creating gaps that the Sussexes instinctively attempted to fill. Yet these attempts only highlighted the invisible barriers, drawing more attention to what was not happening rather than what was. In social dynamics, absence can scream louder than presence, and Kris understood this perfectly. The emotional impact on the Sussexes began to mount. Meghan's carefully maintained poise occasionally flickered. Harry's jaw tightened ever so slightly as he realized that no amount of charm, charisma, or royal recognition could breach the silent wall Kris had constructed. They were famous, influential, and capable of commanding attention anywhere. Yet here, in a room designed for spectacle, they were rendered almost invisible. Yet it wasn't only about exclusion. It was about control, narrative, and image. Kris Jenner has built an empire on storytelling, on shaping perception, and on influencing the gaze of millions. Her silent statement at that party was not merely social. It was strategic. Every guest who observed her cues internalized them. Every photographer who captured the moment interpreted the angles, the spacing, the positioning. Even the media narrative that followed would, in subtle ways, reflect her orchestration. The Sussexes had walked into an environment where perception was reality, and the reality they encountered was meticulously curated. And just when the evening seemed to reach its peak of subtle tension, a moment occurred that even seasoned observers called extraordinary. A brief exchange, a glance, a whispered word that passed unnoticed by most, yet carried volumes. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it reverberated through the room and across social media in ways that would become a story unto itself. For Harry and Meghan, it was a reminder that power in Hollywood, and in life, is often exercised in silence, in small motions, in the spaces between words and gestures. And as the cameras flashed, capturing other guests and celebratory interactions, the Sussexes realized that their night was being shaped not by what was happening, but by what was being withheld: recognition, acknowledgement, and engagement. Kris Jenner's silent statement had been made, and the room had responded in kind. The impact was immediate, personal, and publicly invisible, a paradox that few could articulate, but everyone could feel. But what came next? A private interaction behind the velvet ropes, a whispered conversation that would later leak to insiders and media alike, would escalate the tension far beyond a mere social snub. And it would reveal that the silent choreography of Kris Jenner's control was only the beginning of a drama no one anticipated, a drama that would challenge everything Harry and Meghan thought they knew about Hollywood influence. The moment Harry and Meghan entered the Grand Hall, all eyes didn't just flick toward them. They lingered, darted, whispered, and then deliberately looked away. For a room accustomed to measuring status, gauging influence, and parsing social hierarchy at a glance, the arrival of two figures of global prominence was like a seismic shift in the atmosphere. And yet, While the world expected a cascade of greetings, embraces, and photo opportunities, what followed was something far more subtle, far more calculated: the collective reactions of the guests themselves. From the start, it was clear that this wasn't a room of casual acquaintances. This was a curated network of Hollywood's elite, people whose careers thrive on optics, relationships, and the currency of association. These were actors, directors, producers, and influencers who had learned, often painfully, the unspoken rules of recognition. The moment the Sussexes stepped into the room, each guest had a choice: acknowledge, ignore, or maneuver around. And nearly every guest chose the second and third options. Some reactions were almost imperceptible to the casual observer. A quick glance that faltered before meeting their eyes, a polite nod barely acknowledged, a conversation that paused mid-laugh before resuming as if nothing had happened. But for Harry and Meghan, experienced as they were in reading subtle social cues, the room was signaling something unmistakable. Their presence was noted, but their participation was optional. More than optional, it was strategically limited. Meghan, accustomed to public charm and engagement, tried to bridge the gaps. She leaned in toward a group of guests, offering a warm smile, a playful joke, a casual question. The room reacted with polite but pointed indifference. A laugh rippled around her, but it wasn't directed at her comment. It was a social buffer, a subtle act of exclusion wrapped in the illusion of inclusivity. Harry, ever the protector, remained close, scanning the faces for reactions, recalibrating his approach with each micro-expression, each glance, each shift in posture from those around them. What made it more perplexing was the contrast between overt friendliness and the hidden currents beneath the surface. One guest, known for their charm and humor, stepped forward, extending a hand in greeting. But before contact was fully made, a flick of Kris Jenner's eyes, a subtle gesture, or even an almost imperceptible step back redirected the exchange. The guest smiled, nodded, and moved on. The gesture wasn't rude. It was invisible power at work. It was the message of the night. Acknowledgement is conditional, interaction is controlled, and the Sussexes were being gently, but unmistakably, corralled to the periphery. Across the room, other guests mirrored the same behaviors. Conversations that might have included Harry and Meghan were subtly diverted. Laughter shifted to clusters of guests who had been positioned strategically closer to the matriarch. Handshakes were delayed, polite smiles fleeting. Photographers, sensing the room's direction, shifted their lenses accordingly, capturing moments of the more approved guests while often letting the Sussexes linger at the edges of visibility. Every subtle act reinforced the narrative of control and hierarchy, one that was orchestrated without words but felt viscerally. And yet, there were a few who did not follow the silent script. One or two guests, perhaps unaware of the intricate choreography at play, approached the Sussexes earnestly. There were smiles, attempts at small talk, even brief laughter shared. But each interaction seemed to highlight the gaps in the social performance rather than bridge them. The energy of inclusion was fleeting, easily disrupted by the carefully placed body language of those surrounding Kris Jenner. It was a lesson in power dynamics. The illusion of inclusion can be as effective and often more cutting than outright rejection. The psychological impact was tangible. For Meghan, the careful curation of her public image and her skills in social navigation suddenly felt inadequate. Every step she took toward engagement was met with micro-resistance, a gentle yet unmistakable act that signaled distance. Harry's reaction was quieter but no less intense: subtle tightening of posture, measured scanning of the room, restrained sighs that betrayed a mix of disbelief and frustration. For anyone watching closely, the tension between the Sussexes and the room was electric, unspoken, and almost unbearably delicate. There were moments of ironic humor in all this subtle tension. A guest known for flamboyance, mistaking the Sussexes' proximity as an opportunity, launched into an animated story. Meghan laughed politely, leaning in slightly, only to realize mid-sentence that the attention of others had already shifted elsewhere. Harry offered a courteous chuckle, but his eyes betrayed incredulity. These moments, small as they seemed, were microcosms of the broader social orchestration: inclusion attempted, subtly redirected, and invisibly nullified. Even the interactions between other guests conveyed the social narrative. Whispers floated across the room, fleeting but significant. "Did you see them arrive?" one guest murmured. "Yes," another replied quietly, almost as if sharing a confidential secret. These exchanges, overheard by few and captured by fewer, created a ripple effect. Guests internalized the subtleties, adjusted their behavior, and reinforced the social hierarchy without ever needing explicit instruction. The room collectively acknowledged the Sussexes' presence while maintaining the pretense of politeness, a masterclass in silent, orchestrated social exclusion. Photographers documented these subtleties. A subtle glance averted, a polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a half-step backward. Each frame told a story of its own. By the time the media circulated images of the event, these micro-moments would be analyzed, interpreted, and speculated upon endlessly. Fans dissected body language, speculated about cold shoulders, and debated whether the perceived snubs were deliberate. The online frenzy added an additional layer to the narrative. The Sussexes were now public figures being excluded in real time, a silent drama amplified by the relentless gaze of social media. And yet, within this carefully choreographed atmosphere, contradictions appeared. A guest would briefly engage, their laughter ringing in the room, only to pivot moments later as if following an unspoken directive. A photographer would catch a fleeting smile, capturing it for the world, while another lens deliberately framed the Sussexes at the periphery. The contrasts created confusion, tension, and curiosity. Every observer, whether celebrity, insider, or fan, was left wondering, was this orchestrated or simply the natural chaos of a star-studded gathering? The truth, as it often does, was more complex, layered, and deliberate than anyone suspected. And then came the first sign of public consequence. A whispered text message, sent discreetly across the room, landed on the phone of an influential guest. The content of that message, never intended for broad viewership, immediately altered dynamics. Conversations paused, glances shifted, and the previously unnoticed patterns of exclusion became more pronounced. The Sussexes, aware only in part of these undercurrents, began to sense the full weight of the orchestrated indifference surrounding them. It was no longer just social awkwardness. It was a statement, delivered in silence, executed with precision, and witnessed by a room of people who understood its implications intimately. As the evening unfolded, this interplay of micro-behaviors continued to shape the night. The Sussexes attempted navigation, employing every tool in their social toolkit: charm, humor, small talk, patience. Each attempt was met with polite deflection, subtle distancing, or silent observation. In a room brimming with celebrities, the flashes of cameras are meant to capture brilliance, glamour, and unforgettable moments. For most guests, each click of a shutter is a confirmation of status, a visual affirmation of presence, a testament to influence. For Harry and Meghan, who had entered the hall of Kris Jenner's 70th birthday party with the expectation that cameras would document their arrival, the experience quickly turned surreal. The flashes were there, yes, but not for them. The photographers, normally voracious in capturing every nuance, suddenly seemed selective, strategic, and strangely silent when it came to the Sussexes. It began the instant they stepped onto the red carpet. The paparazzi, usually clamoring to frame the perfect shot, shifted their angles. Cameras would focus on high-profile actors, fashion icons, or the glamorous Kardashian-Jenner family members greeting each other. Harry and Meghan were in the frame, but only incidentally. The energy of the room, the choreography of the event, seemed to direct attention elsewhere. Flashes would go off, but the clicks were calculated, almost surgical in what they captured. Meghan noticed it first. Her eyes scanned the room as she posed politely, giving the subtle, poised smile she had perfected over years of public appearances. She expected photographers to respond, to frame her elegance against the backdrop of Hollywood glamour. But there was a pause. A silence where the usual cacophony of camera shutters should have been. She turned slightly, trying to capture attention, adjusting posture, tilting her head in a photogenic angle. Still, the photographers either looked past her or redirected their lenses to someone else entirely. Harry observed too, but with a measured calm. His training as a royal had prepared him for scrutiny, for public judgment, for moments when optics could define perception. Yet, here was a different kind of visibility, or rather, invisibility. The Sussexes were present, poised, and photogenic, but the very instruments designed to amplify celebrity presence were neglecting them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Every missed click, every camera that pivoted to another guest, spoke volumes about the dynamics of control and influence at play. The room was a masterclass in optics, orchestrated with precision. Kris Jenner, the architect of the event, understood better than anyone the power of the lens. Photographers were positioned not just to document the party, but to document a narrative, one that subtly minimized the Sussexes' role. Camera angles were manipulated, sightlines were controlled, and the seemingly innocent positioning of flashes became a tool of exclusion. Every click that ignored Harry and Meghan reinforced the silent social statement of the night. You are here, but you are peripheral. Some photographers tried to include them, briefly capturing Meghan's laugh or Harry's nod in passing. But even these moments were fleeting, often cropped out in the resulting photos or edited in post-production to highlight other figures. The emotional impact on the Sussexes was immediate. Meghan's carefully maintained composure betrayed a flicker of disappointment. Harry's restrained reaction hinted at the recognition of a broader, intentional pattern. It wasn't just social invisibility in person, it was being erased visually, in real time, in a room where optics were currency. This was amplified by the presence of social media influencers and entertainment journalists in the room. They, too, followed the cues of the matriarch, posting photos, stories, and videos that emphasized certain interactions while subtly omitting others. By the time a clip of the Sussexes in the room circulated online, it was fleeting, almost incidental. The narrative was set. Everyone else was engaged, enjoying the party, and Harry and Meghan were, intentionally or not, marginal figures. It became even more apparent during group photos. Standard practice at such parties is to assemble key figures in the center of the frame, ensuring equal representation. But when the official photographer called for group shots, subtle changes occurred. Kris positioned her family and inner circle in the foreground. The Sussexes were placed slightly to the side, not intentionally hidden, but clearly on the periphery. Every photographer's lens naturally centered on the most strategically positioned individuals, leaving Harry and Meghan captured only in passing. For anyone watching, it appeared almost accidental. For those familiar with social optics, it was a deliberate exclusion. Even when an attempt was made to adjust positions, the effect persisted. A staff member guided the Sussexes slightly closer to the center, only for another photographer to readjust framing. Multiple angles were tried, but each time, the final composition favored other guests. It was subtle, frustrating, and incredibly effective. In Hollywood, the camera does more than capture reality. It shapes it. That night, it had been shaped in a way that rendered the Duke and Duchess of Sussex almost invisible. The emotional implications were undeniable. Meghan's radiant smile became increasingly forced, Harry's composure bordering on taut vigilance. Each photographer's click, each missed frame, each subtle pivot of the lens reinforced a silent narrative. The Sussexes were not part of the inner circle. The visual representation of exclusion carried weight not just in the room, but far beyond, into headlines, Instagram posts, and fan discussions worldwide. Being ignored by the photographers was not just a minor social slight. It was a calculated message. And then, a particularly telling incident occurred. A well-known entertainment journalist, moments away from snapping a photo of Harry and Meghan, received a whispered cue from a nearby staff member and instead shifted focus to another guest. The resulting photo would later dominate social media, with captions praising the captured interaction while the Sussexes were relegated to the background, barely visible. To the untrained eye, it looked like a minor coincidence. But to anyone who understood the dynamics, it was a clear statement of deliberate omission, a visual reinforcement of exclusion, orchestrated with subtle genius. This pattern continued throughout the evening. The Sussexes navigated the room, offering smiles, nods, and casual gestures. Each time, the cameras either failed to capture them properly or prioritized other subjects. Photographers whispered among themselves, glanced toward Kris Jenner, adjusted angles, and subtly enforced the visual hierarchy. It was a choreography of silence, invisibility, and unspoken authority. Every flash that did not capture them was a micro-act of social control, a reminder that in Hollywood, optics often speak louder than words. The subtle messaging didn't end with photos. Video clips captured on mobile phones reflected similar patterns. Angles favoring other guests, interactions emphasized elsewhere, moments of exclusion amplified by framing and focus. As these clips began circulating online in real time, fans and media analysts noticed the pattern. Discussions ignited. Why were the Sussexes barely present visually? Was it a deliberate snub, a technical oversight, or something far more calculated? The answers, when they came, would reveal the extent of orchestration at play that night. And just as the Sussexes thought they could reclaim some presence, a final, dramatic moment occurred. A flash went off as they approached a prominent group, but it was clearly time to capture someone else in mid-laugh. The Sussexes were frozen, momentarily in the frame but visually diminished, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of the silent social hierarchy controlling the evening. It was a humbling, almost surreal experience. The cameras, instruments of visibility, had become agents of erasure. But what came next? A fleeting exchange captured by one determined photographer, one that would later spark heated online discussion and viral analysis, would show that the battle for presence was far from over. And it would mark the beginning of a night where visibility, recognition, and influence were contested in ways that Harry and Meghan could never have anticipated. She had walked into countless rooms filled with royalty, Hollywood stars, and influential figures. She had mastered the art of charm, the nuanced dance of conversation, the subtle play of humor and warmth that could disarm even the most guarded of guests. And yet, on this night, at Kris Jenner's 70th birthday party, everything felt different. Every smile she offered, every small joke, every attempt to engage seemed to drift into an invisible void. It was as if the room itself had silently declared, "Your efforts are noted, but they will not be rewarded." Meghan began her diplomacy with caution, a strategic survey of the room's social terrain. Her eyes swept across clusters of guests, noting the groups, the dynamics, and the subtle currents of power at play. A few celebrities acknowledged her presence, offering polite nods or fleeting smiles. But these gestures were perfunctory at best. The warmth she expected, the social reciprocity she was accustomed to, was conspicuously absent. Every acknowledgement was measured, deliberate, and fleeting, almost as if rehearsed to convey politeness without inclusion. She moved with grace, a deliberate rhythm in her steps, weaving through conversations with a combination of charm and patience. "Hello, it's wonderful to see you," she said to a prominent actor known for his charisma. He responded politely, a faint smile, but then his attention drifted, guided subtly by a glance from Kris Jenner across the room. Meghan's joke, carefully timed to spark laughter, landed with a polite chuckle but received no follow-up engagement. It was clear, this was not personal incompetence. This was a structured, invisible barrier. Harry observed her attempts closely. He was the picture of calm, a protective presence, yet beneath the surface, his mind was cataloging every interaction, every slight, every subtle shift in energy. He knew that Meghan's social skills were formidable, her diplomatic abilities honed by years of navigating both royal protocol and Hollywood scrutiny. Yet even the most skilled diplomacy could falter when the opposition was orchestrating the social environment with invisible precision. Meghan's efforts became more deliberate. She approached another group, offering a compliment to a fashion icon's gown, a playful anecdote about a shared acquaintance, and an engaging smile. The initial response was encouraging, a brief laugh, a nod. But the conversation immediately diverted as another guest made a comment to the group, subtly drawing attention away. The Sussexes were present, yet peripheral. Their visibility existed, but it carried no social weight. It was the kind of invisibility that leaves one highly aware, yet powerless to influence the room. The dynamics were almost theatrical. Kris Jenner, the matriarch, maintained a careful posture, her eyes observing every exchange. A subtle tilt of her head, a glance in another direction, a slight adjustment of her stance, all communicated without words that attention should be allocated elsewhere. The room's occupants, attuned to her signals, followed suit. What Meghan saw as friendly engagement was countered with micro-resistance, a silent nudging back to the periphery. At one point, Meghan tried to join a table conversation. The group paused momentarily, acknowledging her with polite smiles. She offered a clever anecdote, designed to bridge personalities and create warmth. Laughter followed, faint but genuine. Yet the group quickly moved on to topics that excluded her input. The subtle signals were unmistakable, acknowledgement without inclusion. Diplomacy had its limits when the very architecture of the room worked against engagement. There were moments of internal conflict. Meghan, accustomed to commanding presence in any room, felt the rising tension of invisibility. Each failed interaction chipped away at her usual composure. The attempt to maintain poise and elegance required increasing effort, and the weight of subtle rejection became palpable. Every polite dismissal, every diverted gaze, reinforced the message that she was not central to the social narrative of the evening. Harry, ever the vigilant partner, stepped in occasionally, guiding Meghan through the room, introducing her to potential allies, and providing a protective buffer. His interventions, however, were often circumvented by the carefully controlled flow of guests orchestrated by Jenner's subtle cues. Even the act of connecting with others was regulated by the invisible rules of the night. Every smile, handshake, and acknowledgement was mediated through a network of subtle instructions and micro-movements that Harry and Meghan were not privy to. Despite the challenges, Meghan persisted. She navigated corners of the room where she could engage without disruption, offered compliments to hosts and guests, and shared small stories meant to foster connection. Yet, the effect was minimal. While her charm was undeniable, the social currents of the room, orchestrated invisibly, were stronger. The Sussexes were highly visible but lacked influence, a paradox that intensified the tension of the evening. The media, both professional photographers and influencers armed with smartphones, captured every micro-moment. Images circulated online that reflected the subtle exclusion. Meghan in mid-smile, positioned slightly behind others, Harry leaning slightly to create inclusion, yet partially framed out of major shots. The narrative began to emerge in real time. They were present, yet subtly erased from the visual and social hierarchy of the room. Every unsuccessful attempt at diplomacy, every minor social defeat, was amplified by optics and perception. Even the casual observers among guests recognized the pattern. Conversations paused when the Sussexes approached. Laughter shifted to other corners. Interactions that should have included them were redirected. The room's energy, carefully curated, communicated a silent truth. Presence alone does not equal acceptance. Meghan's diplomacy, as skilled as it was, had to contend not with overt hostility, but with an invisible architecture designed to marginalize. And then came a particularly telling moment. Meghan attempted a conversational bridge with a high-profile influencer known for her visibility online. She offered a humorous observation about the party, something designed to elicit laughter and camaraderie. The influencer smiled politely, but as Meghan continued, the individual's attention drifted toward another guest, guided subtly by Kris Jenner's imperceptible gestures. Meghan's joke landed in partial silence. The social energy redirected immediately, leaving her momentarily isolated despite her efforts. It was both humbling and revealing. Diplomacy can win hearts, foster connections, and build influence, but only if the environment allows it. In this carefully choreographed setting, the rules of engagement were predetermined. Meghan's attempts were genuine, her energy and charm undeniable, yet the silent barriers of influence proved far stronger than her personal efforts. The room's collective focus had been shaped without words, a masterclass in subtle social control that left even the most experienced navigating the edges of participation. Yet, Meghan did not relent. She approached another cluster, offering a warm greeting, engaging directly with a few guests, and sharing anecdotes designed to spark connection. The brief moments of engagement felt promising, but were soon countered by the room's subtle orchestration. Attention shifted elsewhere, laughter redirected, and her attempts, though sincere, remained peripheral. Every interaction emphasized the invisible boundaries, teaching the Sussexes a lesson in silent exclusion that few outsiders could comprehend. And just when it seemed Meghan might carve out a space of influence through persistence, a final, unanticipated act shifted the balance once more. A brief glance, a whispered word, a subtle gesture from one of Jenner's inner circle reminded the Sussexes of their position. They could attempt diplomacy, they could offer charm and engagement, but the social hierarchy had already been set. It was an invisible structure designed to maintain control, enforce status, and reinforce subtle exclusion, and it was operating flawlessly. But what happened next, a surprising intervention by an unexpected guest, would alter the evening's social dynamic, creating a ripple that nobody, not even Kris Jenner, had anticipated. And it would push Meghan's diplomacy to its limits in a moment captured by cameras, witnessed by insiders, and dissected later by millions around the world. He had entered the room with measured composure, the kind of calm that had carried him through decades of public scrutiny, military service, and royal protocol. Harry, Duke of Sussex, had learned to control his expressions, to modulate his reactions, to maintain an almost impenetrable exterior while navigating rooms filled with judgment, expectation, and power. But on this night, at Kris Jenner's 70th birthday party, even he felt the tension in a way that threatened to pierce his practiced calm. The silence that followed Harry and Meghan's arrival was more than social awkwardness. It was a carefully orchestrated, invisible snub. He could feel it in the way the room subtly shifted, in the micro-expressions of the guests, in the tiny gestures that communicated exclusion without confrontation. Every glance that flicked past him without acknowledgement, every conversation that paused and then resumed as if he were not present, was a reminder. Here, in this glittering hall of Hollywood elites, visibility was not equivalent to acceptance. Harry's initial approach was restrained, almost casual. He greeted guests with a nod, a smile, or a brief word, attempting to integrate into the room while maintaining dignity. His eyes scanned the crowd continuously, reading the subtle currents of attention and influence. Meghan moved beside him, her attempts at diplomacy in full swing, but even her radiant charm seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier. Harry sensed the unspoken rules immediately. Their presence was noted, their engagement permitted, but only on the terms dictated by the orchestrators of this environment. Every misstep, however minor, carried amplified consequences. Harry understood optics. He had lived under the relentless gaze of the press and public for decades. He knew how a single glance, a brief expression, or a poorly timed word could be spun into headlines, critiques, or memes. But the situation tonight was different. This wasn't about perception alone, it was about control. The room had been curated not only for aesthetics and celebration, but as a stage for the subtle exercise of influence. And in that orchestration, Harry realized they were being intentionally marginalized. As the evening unfolded, Harry's composure was tested repeatedly. A guest would briefly acknowledge him with a nod, only for the conversation to pivot subtly away. A photographer would angle for a perfect shot of the Kardashian-Jenner family, leaving him partially out of frame. Every attempt at connection was countered not with overt hostility, but with controlled, invisible resistance. It was a calculated form of exclusion that cut deeper precisely because it was so silent and so public at the same time. There were moments of internal conflict visible only to Meghan. Harry's jaw would tighten slightly, his eyes narrowing in subtle frustration. He would scan the room, take in the controlled positioning of guests, the direction of conversations, the pacing of interactions, and then adjust his approach. He wasn't angry in the explosive, confrontational sense, at least, not yet. But there was a simmering intensity in his demeanor, a quiet fury that spoke louder than any words could. The dynamics were exacerbated by the presence of cameras and social media observers. Every micro-expression, every restrained sigh, every subtle tightening of posture was being captured, potentially amplified, and later scrutinized by millions worldwide. Harry was acutely aware of this, and it added another layer to his internal calculus. How to respond, how to protect Meghan, how to maintain composure, and how to navigate the silent hierarchy of influence that defined this room. A particularly telling moment occurred when Meghan attempted to engage a cluster of guests. Harry's protective instincts kicked in, guiding her subtly, interjecting politely where necessary, ensuring she was not left isolated. But even his interventions were moderated by the invisible orchestration of the room. Guests' attention would divert in the blink of an eye, whispers would circulate, and subtle gestures would redirect energy elsewhere. Harry recognized the pattern instantly. This was not mere social awkwardness. This was a meticulously choreographed game of influence, and they were being systematically relegated to the periphery. Despite his training, Harry felt the sting of the unspoken exclusion. For someone who had spent his life in structured environments, accustomed to protocol, recognition, and measured social exchange, the room's silent marginalization was disorienting. Each ignored greeting, each diverted conversation, each camera lens that skimmed past him without focus, reinforced a narrative that was both public and deeply personal. Presence alone did not guarantee acknowledgement. Harry's response was deliberate, calculated, and silent, a contrast to Meghan's more proactive diplomacy. He maintained composure outwardly, masking internal frustration with measured gestures, quiet observation, and subtle protective movements. He positioned himself strategically, assessing the room, calculating engagement points, and monitoring the subtle choreography of attention. Every action was carefully chosen to balance dignity, influence, and the need to protect both himself and Meghan in a room designed to control social perception. Yet, there were moments when the restraint faltered, barely perceptible but unmistakable to those attuned to micro-expressions. A slight exhale, a brief tightening of lips, a subtle furrow of the brow. These were flashes of silent fury, restrained yet visible. Meghan noticed them, and they conveyed more than words could. The recognition that they were being deliberately sidelined, and the quiet determination to navigate and survive the orchestrated social landscape of the party. The psychological impact was compounded by the knowledge that the exclusion was intentional. The guests were not simply unaware or distracted. They were following cues, consciously or unconsciously enforcing the social hierarchy that Kris Jenner had silently established. The network of glances, whispers, and body language formed a matrix of control, dictating attention and influence. For Harry, understanding the orchestration was one thing. Dealing with it in real time, in a room of cameras and observers, was another. Tension escalated as the evening progressed. Meghan continued her attempts at diplomacy, offering warmth, humor, and connection. Harry remained vigilant, his presence a stabilizing force, yet the room's energy continually challenged them both. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of silent control. Every effort to integrate was subtly redirected, every acknowledgement diluted by calculated indifference. The Sussexes were visible yet peripheral, noticed yet marginalized, a paradox that fueled Harry's internal, silent fury. And then, a moment occurred that crystallized the